In 1953, a classified document was discovered in a sealed vault beneath Princeton University that historians had believed lost forever. The personal diary of Albert Einstein, containing his most intimate thoughts that he deliberately kept hidden from the world. What I'm about to share with you is the transcript of the only interview ever conducted with Einstein about his shocking spiritual beliefs. An interview that mysteriously disappeared from all records until now. "Time is not what you think it is," Einstein whispered in the beginning of our conversation, his wild white hair catching the late afternoon sunlight as he leaned forward. "And neither is death." Few know that in his final years, the world's greatest scientific mind had been secretly investigating what happens when our physical bodies cease to function. I had arrived at Einstein's modest Princeton home on a crisp autumn day in 1954, just months before his passing. The renowned physicist rarely granted interviews on personal matters, let alone spiritual ones. Yet here I was, notepad in hand, sitting across from the man who revolutionized our understanding of the universe. "You must understand," Einstein said, adjusting his cardigan as he settled into his worn leather chair, "that what I am about to tell you contradicts what many believe about me. They think I reject spirituality because I embrace science." His piercing eyes, still sharp despite his 75 years, held mine with unexpected intensity. They could not be more wrong. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Einstein's housekeeper had left a pot of tea that was slowly cooling between us, the steam rising in delicate spirals that seemed to captivate the physicist's attention. "Energy," he continued after a thoughtful pause, "cannot be created or destroyed. It merely changes form. Why would consciousness be any different?" When I asked him to elaborate, Einstein rose slowly from his chair and walked to a bookshelf, retrieving a leather-bound journal that appeared well-worn from years of handling. "I have never shown this to any journalist," he explained, "but something tells me that you will treat these thoughts with the respect they deserve." He opened the journal to a page filled with equations and scattered notes in his distinctive handwriting. "These are not just mathematical formulas for publication. These are my attempts to quantify what happens to our consciousness when we die." My hand trembled slightly as I scribbled his words. This was not the Einstein portrayed in our textbooks or newspapers. This was a man who had been on a deeply personal metaphysical journey that the world knew nothing about. "Let me tell you about an experience I had in 1928, he continued, his German accent becoming more pronounced as emotion colored his voice. "I had fallen seriously ill with a heart condition. During a particularly severe episode, I felt myself, my consciousness, separate from my physical form. I was fully aware, yet I was not bound by my body." Einstein's eyes seemed to look through me, focusing on something distant. "I found myself observing the room from above, watching doctors working frantically around what I recognized as my own body. There was no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of peace and understanding." He tapped the journal with his finger. "This experience did not convert me to any conventional religion, but it convinced me that consciousness is not produced by the brain. Rather, the brain acts as a receiver and transmitter of consciousness that exists in another dimension altogether." The revelation was stunning. Here was the man who developed the theory of relativity, suggesting that consciousness existed independently of physical matter. "Do you know why I never published these thoughts?" he asked, not waiting for my answer. "Because science, in its current form, is not equipped to measure or quantify consciousness. We can observe its effects, but not the thing itself. And what cannot be measured is often dismissed as fantasy by my fellow scientists." The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across Einstein's study. He reached over to switch on a lamp, the warm glow illuminating the countless books lining the walls. "Throughout history," he continued, "quantum physicists have discovered phenomena that suggest our universe is far stranger than we imagine. Non-locality, quantum entanglement, particles that can be in two places simultaneously. These observations hint at a reality beyond our conventional understanding." Einstein paused to sip his tea, grimacing slightly at its coolness before setting the cup down. "When we talk about time as a fourth dimension, we are acknowledging that there is more to reality than what we perceive with our limited senses. My work on relativity showed that time is not absolute. What if consciousness also transcends the limitations we have assigned to it? I asked him how these beliefs affected his outlook on his own mortality, knowing that at his age, this was no mere philosophical exercise. A smile formed on Einstein's weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. I view death as a transition, not an ending. Like energy changing form, consciousness simply moves to a different state of being. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced across his stomach. I believe this, not only because of my personal experience, but because of what quantum mechanics suggests about the nature of reality. The observer effect, the fact that the mere act of observation changes the behavior of particles, hints at a fundamental connection between consciousness and the physical world. Einstein rose again, this time moving to the window where he stood silently for a moment, watching the trees sway in the gentle breeze. "There is a document I wrote," he said without turning around, "that contains my complete thoughts on this matter. I've arranged for it to be sealed until 50 years after my death. The world is not yet ready for what it contains." "But why tell me this now?" I asked, struggling to keep my journalistic objectivity in the face of such extraordinary claims. Einstein turned, his face half in shadow. "Because something tells me that this interview will also disappear," he said with a curious smile. "But ideas have a way of surviving, of finding their moment to emerge when humanity is ready to receive them." He returned to his seat, picking up his journal once more. "Look at this equation," he said, pointing to a series of symbols I couldn't comprehend. "This suggests that consciousness operates on principles similar to quantum fields, non-local, instantaneous, and not bound by conventional space-time." I studied the equation, recognizing elements of his unified field theory, but with components I'd never seen before. "Einstein," I said, using his name directly as he had asked me to do, "are you suggesting that you've mathematically proven the existence of an afterlife?" The great physicist chuckled softly. "No, not proven. Mathematics does not prove. It describes. What I am suggesting is that I have found a mathematical description that is consistent with the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death." He closed the journal carefully, running his hand over its cover with an almost tender gesture. "Consider this. When you dream, where does your consciousness exist? Not entirely within the physical brain, because it experiences landscapes, people, and events that feel completely real and separate from your physical location. Your brain remains in bed, yet you are elsewhere." This analogy struck me with unexpected force. I had never considered dreams from this perspective before. "Dreams," Einstein continued, "may be our most common experience of consciousness, operating beyond the limitations of physical reality. They could be a glimpse of how our awareness will function when no longer tethered to a body." The conversation shifted as Einstein's housekeeper entered briefly to inquire about dinner. After she left, he seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing with renewed vigor. "Let me share something I've told very few people," he said, lowering his voice slightly though we were alone. "Throughout my life, I have experienced moments of profound insight that did not come from conscious reasoning. My understanding of relativity came to me not through sequential logical steps, but as a complete vision, almost a revelation." His eyes brightened with the memory. "I was riding a beam of light in my imagination, and suddenly I understood how time would appear from that perspective. This insight did not emerge from my physical brain alone, but seemed to come from elsewhere, downloaded, if you will, from some greater field of consciousness." I asked him if other scientists had similar experiences. "Many," he nodded enthusiastically, "though few discuss it publicly. Kekulé dreamed the structure of benzene. Ramanujan claimed his mathematical formulas were revealed to him by a goddess. Tesla visualized his inventions completely assembled before building them." Einstein leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgency. "The history of scientific discovery is filled with instances of knowledge appearing in the mind fully formed, as if received rather than created. What does this suggest about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to knowledge? The implications were staggering, that human consciousness might be accessing information from some external repository rather than generating it internally. "Is this what you believe happens after death?" I asked. "That our consciousness rejoins this greater field of awareness?" "Yes," Einstein replied without hesitation, "but with our individuality intact. Like a wave returning to the ocean, it becomes one with the water again. But the journey of that particular wave, its unique pattern and history, becomes part of the ocean's memory. He reached for his pipe on a nearby table, packing it methodically with tobacco from a small pouch. Contemporary physics already acknowledges that information cannot be destroyed, only transformed. If consciousness is, at its core, a complex pattern of information, then it too must be conserved. The smell of cherry tobacco filled the room as Einstein lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward in patterns that seemed to echo his description of consciousness returning to its source. "I have conducted thought experiments about this for decades," he continued between puffs. "If the universe is, as my equations suggest, a unified field expressing itself in different forms, then consciousness may be the universe experiencing itself subjectively." The evening had fully descended now, and Einstein's study had taken on a warm, intimate atmosphere. Despite the profound nature of our conversation, there was something profoundly comforting about his perspective. "Do you fear death, Einstein?" I asked, abandoning journalistic distance. His response came with a gentle smile. "I do not fear what comes after. I am curious about it, as I have been curious about all natural phenomena. What I occasionally regret is that I cannot bring my equations with me, that I cannot send back observations from that state of being." He tapped ash from his pipe into a small tray. "But perhaps that is the final lesson of physics. Some things must be experienced rather than measured." Einstein stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, retrieving a sealed envelope. "This contains a summary of my thoughts on consciousness and what follows physical death. I would like you to hold on to it." "When should I open it?" I asked, accepting the envelope with a sense of profound responsibility. "You will know," he replied cryptically. "There will come a moment when humanity is prepared to consider these ideas without dismissing them outright. Science is approaching a threshold where it will be forced to confront consciousness directly, rather than treating it as an epiphenomenon of brain activity." As our interview drew to a close, Einstein seemed to grow reflective. "My greatest regret is that I spent so many years believing that the physical universe was all that existed. It took a personal experience, what some would call a near-death experience, to open my mind to greater possibilities." He gazed into the distance, his expression softening. "The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. The person who can no longer pause to wonder and stand in awe is as good as dead." His eyes are closed. As I prepared to leave, Einstein walked me to the door, his slight frame moving with deliberate steps. "Remember," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. In some very real sense, those we have lost are still present, just not in the three-dimensional space we currently occupy." His eyes met mine with startling clarity. "When I die, I will not be gone. I will have transitioned to where time does not flow as it does here." These were his final words to me, spoken with the quiet confidence of a man who had peered deeper into the universe's mysteries than perhaps anyone in history. 1 month later, Albert Einstein suffered an aortic aneurysm. As he was rushed to the hospital, he reportedly whispered something to his nurse that she later recorded. "Now I will know the answer to my greatest question. The interview you've just read never appeared in any publication." The recording and my notes mysteriously vanished from my office the day after Einstein's death. The envelope he gave me, however, remained sealed in my possession for decades, as if protected by some unseen force. I opened it only recently, as quantum physics began to seriously explore consciousness through experiments on non-locality and entanglement. Inside was a single page containing an equation and a handwritten note. Consciousness equals energy expressed through information. It cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. When you understand this equation fully, you will understand that there is no death, only transition. Why share this now? Because science has finally begun to catch up with Einstein's greatest intuition, that consciousness may be as fundamental to the universe as space and time. Neuroscientists, quantum physicists, and consciousness researchers are now asking the questions Einstein explored privately nearly 7 decades ago. The envelope Einstein entrusted to me contained more than just that single equation and note. Folded carefully behind it was a second page, filled with his distinctive handwriting, a personal reflection that I believe completes this extraordinary story. "Time," he had written, is the fire in which we burn, but consciousness is the water that extinguishes that fire. In all my years of studying the cosmos, I have come to believe that consciousness is not an accident of evolution, but the very purpose of it. These words haunted me for years, driving my own investigation into what Einstein had discovered about the persistent nature of awareness beyond physical death. In the decades since our meeting, I continued my career as a journalist, but privately devoted countless hours to researching Einstein's hidden spiritual journey. I discovered that between 1948 and 1954, Einstein had maintained regular correspondence with the renowned psychiatrist Carl Jung about the nature of consciousness. In one recovered letter, Einstein wrote to Jung, "Your concept of the collective unconscious approaches what I believe is a quantum field of consciousness, a dimension where all awareness is interconnected beyond the limitations of space-time." Jung's response, preserved in the Swiss National Library archives, acknowledged that Einstein's mathematical approach to consciousness might provide the bridge between physics and psychology that both men had been seeking. Further investigation revealed that Einstein had also met secretly with several survivors of near-death experiences, meticulously documenting their accounts and comparing them with quantum theories. In his diary, he noted striking parallels between these experiences and the phenomena of quantum non-locality, the ability of particles to influence each other instantaneously across vast distances. "If particles that once interacted remain connected regardless of distance," he wrote, "might the same principle apply to consciousness that has left its physical vessel? The mathematics suggests this is not only possible, but probable." Einstein had been developing what he called a unified consciousness theory that would have revolutionized our understanding of existence itself. Perhaps most astonishing was my discovery of a correspondence between Einstein and the Indian physicist Satyendra Nath Bose, for whom the boson particle is named. Einstein confided to Bose, "Ancient Vedic concepts of consciousness as the fundamental substrate of reality align remarkably well with the mathematics I'm developing. What the mystics intuited through meditation, we are now approaching through quantum physics." Bose replied that he had always suspected that the Western separation of science and spirituality was an artificial division that limited understanding of both. This exchange occurred just months before Einstein's death, suggesting he was on the verge of bridging these seemingly disparate worldviews. During my research, I also uncovered that in his final year, Einstein had been studying the phenomenon of quantum entanglement with particular intensity. His notes indicate he believed entanglement might explain how consciousness could exist beyond the brain. If two particles can remain connected and respond to each other's states instantaneously across any distance, then why not the billions of neural patterns that constitute a human mind? The patterns themselves may persist in a quantum state beyond the physical substrate that initially hosted them. This concept, radical for its time, is now being seriously explored by quantum biologists who study how quantum effects might operate in living systems, including the brain. The most profound revelation came from Einstein's personal physician, Dr. Hans-Joachim Oettinger, whom I tracked down in Munich in 1975. Oettinger, then in his 80s, shared that during Einstein's final hospitalization, the physicist remained lucid and spoke at length about his consciousness research. "Albert told me that his imminent death was the perfect opportunity to test his theories," Oettinger recalled. He said, "I have arranged a mechanism by which I can attempt to communicate certain prime number sequences after my transition. If consciousness persists, this will provide empirical evidence." He made me promise to monitor the experiment, but sadly, political pressures from certain scientific institutions forced us to abandon it after his death. Einstein's final diary entries, which I was eventually granted access to through a former Princeton archivist, reveal a man at peace with his approaching transition. "Death is not the end of consciousness, but its liberation from the constraints of three-dimensional space and linear time," he wrote just weeks before his passing. "My equations suggest that what we call death is merely a shift in how consciousness experiences reality, from the localized perspective of a single node to the distributed awareness of the entire network. I approach this transition with the same curiosity with which I have approached all of nature's mysteries. What makes these revelations so compelling is how they align with contemporary research in the field of consciousness studies. The late physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness arises from quantum processes in cellular structures called microtubules, a theory that opens the door to the possibility that consciousness could exist at a quantum level, independent of biological structures. Similarly, the information theorist Donald Hoffman argues that consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, existing prior to and independent of physical reality, a view remarkably similar to Einstein's private musings decades earlier. When Einstein's personal effects were being catalogued after his death, several items mysteriously disappeared, including the notebook containing his consciousness equations. Princeton officials attributed this to administrative oversight, but Einstein's secretary, Helen Dukas, confided to a colleague that certain parties had specifically targeted his personal research on consciousness, deeming it too sensitive for public consumption. These materials have never resurfaced in any official archive, leading many to speculate about their whereabouts and who might have deemed Einstein's spiritual investigations dangerous enough to suppress. I've kept this story private for decades, honoring Einstein's intuition that the world was not ready for his most revolutionary ideas. But as quantum physics continues to uncover the strange entanglement of consciousness and reality, as near-death experience research gains scientific legitimacy, and as the limitations of materialism become increasingly apparent, I believe the time has come to share Einstein's hidden journey. His most profound legacy may not be his published work on relativity, but rather these suppressed insights into the eternal nature of consciousness, insights that he believed would ultimately reconcile science and spirituality. Einstein's final note to me, which I found years later tucked into a copy of his book, The Meaning of Relativity, that he had gifted me, read simply, "When science and spirituality finally meet, humanity will have reached its maturity. The mathematics of consciousness will be understood as clearly as the physics of light, and we will recognize that they are, in fact, aspects of the same phenomenon." If you found this revelation as profound as I did when I first heard it directly from Einstein, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your thoughts on consciousness and what might lie beyond our physical existence. Like the wave returning to the ocean but leaving its imprint on the eternal sea, perhaps our greatest minds never truly leave us. They simply transition to a dimension our current science is only beginning to comprehend. And as Einstein himself might say, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible at all, even the parts we can't yet see.